What's up guys, Asian here with another build video. Today we're going to be going over the Magicka Nightblade, a top competitor for the best Magicka DPS paired up against the Magicka Sorcerer. The Magicka Nightblade can definitely pull higher DPS than the Magicka Sorc, however it does come with the downside of having a very steep learning curve compared to the Magicka Sorcerer. A lot of people try to compare the two, and it's really difficult to compare the two parses because Magicka Sorcs have a very easy learning curve comparatively. It's basically, you know, drop 2 or 3 dots and you just spammable, and you know, if Crystal Frags procs, you use that, or you know, you heavy attack every once in a while. Versus the Nightblade, where you kind of have to take a note of where your dots lie, and you got to keep track of your bow procs, and you want to maximize the number of bow procs you get, so you're constantly switching bars, and it's a lot more involved, is the best way for me to put it. But it's very rewarding, and it does pull higher DPS on average than the Magicka Sorcerer. So we're going to start things off with our gear. For our Monster Helm, we are using Valken Skoria. I have 1 medium and 1 light. Notice that I am not using a health enchant, even though I am using Witchmother's Potent Brew, and that's because of a passive under the Shadow line, which improves my health. Plus, Skoria has a 1-piece max health effect, so I already have additional health, so I don't need to use a health enchant in order to get myself up to an appropriate level of health. So that means I can use Magicka enchant on all of my pieces of armor. For my 5-piece, we are using Julianos. Julianos is a crafted set. It's a very powerful set. There are a couple of alternatives that you can use instead of Julianos if you want to experiment a little bit. You can try out something like Scathing Mage, or you can try Burning Spellweave, or you can even try out War Maiden. But ultimately, Julianos is going to pull higher DPS than all 3 of those combined. Burning Spellweave and Scathing Mage lose out because of the uptime. You just can't maintain the same level of uptime that you used to be able to in previous patches. And then War Maiden loses out because less than 75% of your DPS comes from pure magic damage, typically speaking, so Julianos will win out over War Maiden. But out of those 4 choices, Julianos comes out on top, and then probably I'd say War Maiden, and then Scathing Mage and Burning Spellweave, depending on your proc chances on using those 2 sets there. For our 4-piece effect, we're going to go with Infallible Aether. You can use any other of the Minor Slayer sets, so Moondancer or Master Architect. I have all spell damage glyphs. Magicka Nightblades are notorious for having a very good Magicka sustain because of a skill that they have called Siphoning Strikes. We'll go over that when we go over skills. So you don't need to necessarily use a regen glyph on a Magicka Nightblade. You have plenty of sustain already without using a regen glyph. You can easily sustain yourself through a 5 to 6 minute long boss fight without the need of an additional glyph there. For our front bar, you're going to go with an infused inferno staff of whatever Minor Slayer set you decide to run with a shock damage enchant. If you don't have a Minor Slayer staff, you can still use just a random infused lightning staff if you'd like, and then you can also replace your Minor Slayer jewelry with willpower. Again, that's if you don't have a full Minor Slayer set. Otherwise, Minor Slayer is going to end up pulling slightly ahead compared to a willpower. And again, you can use any of the Minor Slayer sets, Infallible Aether, Moondancer, or Master Architect. Moondancer and Master Architect will actually pull slightly higher compared to Infallible Aether, but it's not actually that big of a difference. So it's really up to you however you want to do it. Now for your enchant, definitely try to stick with shock if you can, but if you want to be a little bit more selfish, you can go with the flame damage enchant. The shock damage enchant just helps maintain concussed uptime, which helps off-balance uptime, so that's why we're using the shock damage enchant there. And for our backbar, we have a Nerien'eth Maelstrom Lightning staff with a weapon damage enchant. You can go with Precise or Sharpened on your backbar. Both of them are going to lose out to Nerien'eth. Except for Sharpened, if you go over the penetration cap with Sharpened by a certain amount, around 600 or 700, you end up losing out to Nerien'eth because you're over penetrating. Otherwise, Sharpen is going to end up usually pulling higher DPS as long as you're underneath that penetration cap. So that's something you want to keep in mind when you're taking a look at your weapon trait. If you are going to push yourself above the penetration cap with Sharpened with all your debuffs up, then you're better off using Infused, Nerien'eth, Precise instead. So that's kind of it. One thing to take note of for monster helms, you can use Nerien'eth if you want to, but you're not really going to see that much of an increase in actual in-raid performance. It'll be really good for dummy parses, but not necessarily great for your raid performance, because Nerien'eths, I kind of covered this under Nerien'eth versus the Nerien'eth versus Lambris video under Theory Crafting with the Magicka Sorcerer. Nerien'eth is dependent on the boss staying still, so you can get that proc to hit the boss. If the boss is moving around a lot, then Skoria is going to win out, because it is guaranteed to get that hit on the boss no matter what. It's kind of the same deal with Lambris 2 and other sort of proc sets. If the boss is very mobile, it can move out of your proc damage, and you end up basically wasting your proc. So that's something you want to keep in mind if you decide to go with Nerien'eths. The one piece effect is still the exact same though, so you still can use all Magicka enchants on your pieces if you decide to use Nerien'eths instead. Going over our attributes, we have 64 points into Magicka. You don't really have a need to put any points into health because you are using Skoria's, which gives you the extra health, so it does manage to get you over to 17k health with Witchmother, so you don't necessarily need to put any points into health. However, if you are having trouble surviving, then yes, you can put a couple of points into health to help you survive a little bit more. For our Mundus stone, we're going with the Apprentice. You can go with the Lover for 4-man content or solo stuff like VMA. Just keep in mind, if you do decide to use the Lover, again, the same deal with Sharpened. If you're going over the penetration cap with the Lover, you're going to end up losing DPS compared to using the Apprentice. So for well-organized raid groups or even semi-organized raid groups, Apprentice is typically going to win out over the Lover, because you will typically be over-penetrating with the Lover in a 12-man raid. Now, I am a vampire. That gives me 10% additional Magicka regen. You don't need to be stage 4, you can be stage 2 and still get that additional regen, but do keep in mind that if you maintain yourself at stage 4 like I am, because you're lazy or whatever, you will take additional fire damage. So that's something you want to keep in mind. So you might want to feed if you're going to do a trial with a lot of fire damage, or you aren't very confident in your ability to react to mechanics or things like that. I am a Dark Elf. Dunmer are arguably the best race for a Nightblade because of your ultimate is going to be Fiery Rage, and that contributes a lot of DPS, plus you are using a Fire Staff, so you are getting a little bit more out of your light attacks and heavy attacks on your Inferno Staff, plus you also get that passive boost to Skoria proc as well. You get that 7% additional flame damage on your Skoria proc. Other races that you could potentially use include the Altmer. They have less fire damage, but they do gain a little bit of shock damage, so you will gain some additional DPS from your shock damage glyph as well as your Blockade. Plus you get a little bit more max Magicka. They have 10% versus Dark Elves 9% max Magicka. Plus you get an additional 9% Magicka regen, so that helps out your sustain even more. Another potential choice is Bretons. You get 10% additional Magicka with Bretons. You get some additional spell resistance, so that helps out your survivability. Plus you get 3% reduction in your Magicka costs for your abilities. So that is a worse sustain overall compared to 9% regen from Altmer, but it's still a boost to your sustain overall. A Dark Horse race that you can potentially use as a Magicka DPS is going to actually be Argonians, because you do get additional health, making you more survivable. You do get additional Magicka, however it's only 5% additional Magicka, but it's still Magicka nonetheless. But the big part comes from your potion passive, where if you drink a potion, you gain health, stamina, and Magicka. It's basically a tripod along with whatever potion you decide to use, in this case spell power potions. So that really helps out with your already pretty good sustain. So on an Argonian Magicka Nightblade DPS, you can pretty much be assured that up until execute, you're pretty much going to stay above 50% Magicka, assuming you don't die or have to double cast things because of mechanics or things like that. So Argonians are kind of the dark horse race for Nightblades. Going over our skills, our front bar we have Impale, which is our execute. Funnel health, you can use the other morph, Swallow Soul, I believe it's called. Yes, Swallow Soul, which gives you minor vitality while it's slotted, which improves your healing received. Funnel health will heal somebody else for 25% of the damage you inflict, so it does give you a little bit of healing ability there. So I prefer Funnel health over Swallow Soul. Swallow Soul is the more selfish choice. You have Twisting Path. You can actually use Refreshing Path. It does result in a significant loss in DPS. It's about 2 to 3k loss in DPS, but you gain that additional heal from Refreshing Path, which can help out when you're doing things like no death runs for the Vet DLC dungeons, or if you want to help heal out your allies in Vet trials. at the expense of your personal DPS. So that is an option, but Twisting Path generally will give you 2 to 3k additional DPS overall. Then you have Merciless Resolve, Inner Light, and Fiery Rage, which is going to be our primary ultimate. On our backbar, we have our Shield, Harness Magicka. We have Crippling Grasp. You can use the other morph of Grippling Grasp. You can use Debilitate instead. Crippling Grasp doesn't actually give you that much additional DPS. It is a slight increase. The advantage of using Debilitate versus Crippling Grasp is that you can apply Debilitate to multiple enemies, which really helps out. Plus, when an enemy dies while you have Debilitate on them, you get 50% of the ability's cost back as Magicka, so that helps out your sustain a little bit. So you get back about 1450 additional Magicka if you use Debilitate. So it's kind of an up to you. Crippling Grasp does give you just a little bit more DPS, but Debilitate is also a very good choice as well, especially for trash fights where you can apply it to multiple enemies. Then you have Blockade of Storms, Siphoning attacks, you have Inner Light again, and then you have Soul Harvest. You're not really going to be using this as your primary ultimate. That's just there for the Assassination passive to maintain Hemorrhage, which increases your critical damage done, but only when you have an assassination ability slotted. So that's the primary purpose of Soul Harvest, so we do continue to get that 10% additional crit damage boost while we're on our back bar. Plus, you do get additional ultimate whenever you kill an enemy while you're on your back bar, so it's a quick and easy way. You kind of drop your Destro ulti, you swap to your back bar, and you basically use Blockade, Debilitate, and you heavy attack on your lightning staff to get back some additional ultimate. So that is something to keep in mind there. In addition, during Execute, a lot of Magicka Nightblades will actually use Soul Harvest as their ultimate instead of Fiery Rage because it's cheaper, plus it increases the damage you deal by 20% for 6 seconds, so you do Soul Harvest and your Execute is going to hit for a truckload of damage. So that's kind of where you can use Soul Harvest, particularly during your Execute phase, and I'll show you that during our rotation discussion and our Parse. So that's pretty much it for skills. We're going to move on to CP points. For our green CP, we have 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Nasty. That leaves 80 points, which can be divided into the remaining 3 nodes, however you'd like. I'm actually going to redistribute them a little bit. So I have 26 into Warlord, 26 into Tumbling, and 28 into Shadow Ward. Again, you can redistribute those however you'd like. For our blue CP, I have 40 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, 32 into Spell Erosion, 34 into Master at Arms, and 75 into Thaumaturge. Now I'm going to take a minute here to talk about Spell Erosion. I do have higher than average points into Spell Erosion. That's because of the group that I run with. We only get Elemental Drain, Power of the Light, and Infused Thorax Crusher, so we're missing out on the Alkosh debuff, which is why I have that many points into Spell Erosion. So if you are running that, you're going to want to take points out of Elfborn first, then Master at Arms, and then put them into Spell Erosion. You kind of want to avoid touching Elemental Expert if you can, and you definitely don't want to take any points out of Thaumaturge because that's how you maintain your Exploiter passive. So if you have more, if you do have the Alkosh debuff, then you obviously want to take points out of Spell Erosion so you're not over-penetrating. And then you want to put those, again, back into Master at Arms and Elfborn and Elemental Expert. So that's kind of why I have a bunch of points to Spell Erosion right now. As for our red CPs, this is kind of going to vary depending on the content you're going to run. For example, in Vet Maw, you're going to want to put a little bit more points into Elemental Expert compared to Hardy because you're going to take more magic damage compared to physical damage. So you're going to want to see what content you're going to run and then adjust your CP accordingly. So this is a one-size-fits-most distribution. I have 44 into Ironclad, 40 into Thick Skin, 56 into Hardy and Elemental Defender, and 34 into Bastion. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about our rotation. So there's kind of 2 schools of thought when it comes to Nightblade rotation. I'll be going over both of them. And the first one is for people who are just starting to learn Magicka Nightblades, and that's basically you just stick with a mostly static rotation and you end up overcasting your twisting path basically. So I'm going to quickly just put down Elemental Drain instead of our shield for our Parse. So basically what you want to do is before you start your boss fight, you're going to want to buff up with Merciless and Siphoning. Then you're going to drink your potion and then start off with an ultimate obviously, but then you're going to start on your back bar. So for a static rotation, a kind of a I'm learning how to do Magblade rotation, you do your buffs, You lay down your dots. You use your bow proc. Then you go back. You relay down your dots whenever you can. You re-up your Siphoning strikes like so. But basically what you're doing is you're basically always going to be using Grippling Grasp or Debilitate after you use Blockade. And so you're not going to prioritize your bow proc. Instead you're going to prioritize maintaining an easy-ish, I should say, rotation. So it's basically, let me eat some food so I have higher Magicka and better sustain. So basically what it's going to look like again, pre-buff, Blockade, Crippling, Twisting, Weave, bow proc when it procs. So now then you can either wait until Twisting Path runs out, or you can immediately cast it again when you swap to your front bar. So it would look like this instead. And you aren't prioritizing your bow procs. So even if you get a bow proc while you're on your back bar, so let's say you're swap to your bar here, and you're about to cast Siphoning. Under the second rotation I'm going to show you, you would swap, do your bow proc, and then swap back to recast your Siphoning strikes. But on your simplified rotation, you just continue on with your rotation, and you use your bow proc when you go back to your front bar. So you're not bar swapping a lot in order to maximize your bow proc, your bow procs. The more advanced rotation is going to be maximizing your bow proc. So you start off the exact same way with buffing yourself with Merciless, Siphoning. So basically you're prioritizing your bow procs first, even if that means giving up a little bit of your dot uptime. So see here, I swap, do my bow proc, go back to my back bar, and then use Crippling Grasps. So that's kind of the more advanced version of the rotation. This is something I don't recommend that you do until you really start to get the hang of your weaving as well as your bar swapping. So that's kind of what a lot of expert or the top DPS Magicka Nightblades end up doing. So because of that, if you watch the top mag blades in the game, for example LZH, you'll see that their dots are kind of all over the place. While they start off somewhat synchronized, and towards the end of the fight, you see they're kind of all over the place. You have 2 seconds left on Blockade, you have 4 seconds left on Grippling Grasp, you have 5 seconds left on Twisting Path. So that's kind of how the best of the best Magicka Nightblades do. They prioritize the bow proc over maintaining their dots. Now we're going to be talking about execute phase, and so different people have different opinions on how to go about your execute phase. So the bare minimum that you're going to want to maintain is going to be Blockade, Siphoning Strikes, and Twisting Path during your execute. So you start execute at 25%. So you're basically going to drop Crippling Grasp in during your execute phase. And then you're also going to ignore your bow procs. You will maintain Merciless Resolve for that minor Berserk buff, but you're not going to be using your bow proc because your Impale is going to hit as hard as or harder than your bow proc, so there's no point in using that bow proc anymore. You're still going to want to light weave, obviously, to maintain your DPS, but you're not going to be using your bow procs if they happen. So basically, what it's going to look like is basically you're going to have maintain your Blockade, your Siphoning, and you're just going to execute like so. Obviously maintaining Merciless Resolve. This dummy only had about 150k health, so I wasn't going to really be able to show you guys the execute. So once it respawns, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So for execute, assuming you have Merciless up and Siphoning up, you're going to drop Crippling, you're just going to use Blockade and Path, and you're just going to spam. You're going to ignore that bow proc, and just reapply your dots as they happen. And you're just going to keep on doing this. And that's how most mag blades take care of the execute phase. And then obviously re-up Siphoning and Merciless Resolve when they expire. So that's kind of how execute works for Magicka Nightblades. And again, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to be using your Soul Assault, or not Soul Assault, Soul Harvest ultimate for that extra 20% damage. So basically what I do during execute is if I'm on my Blockade and I have my Soul Harvest up and I'm at range and I know that my ultimate's going to be up soon, I kind of get in there, use it, and then back off back into my range, unless it's a fight where I can stay at melee range, for example against a Serpent, against, you know, so that's kind of the fights that where I'm able to go into melee range safely and kind of stay in melee range during execute phase. The Mage, for instance, during execute is another one that you can kind of basically stay stacked for melee. The Manticora in SO, for Maw, the Twins, for instance, you can basically grit right up against the Twins. But for fights like Zazhasha or the Warrior, where you have specific spots, it's going to be a little bit trickier, and you're going to want to talk with your raid lead about it, and you know, discuss whether or not you want your Magicka Nightblades to use Soul Harvest during execute for that additional boost in DPS. Some raid leads will be alright with it, other raid leads will say no. In my personal opinion, it's going to depend on the group, your discipline, and whether you know the mechanics enough to know when to go in. So for example, in Zazhasha, if you go in after he throws out a curse, because he won't throw out a curse immediately afterwards, and the circle spread has ended, and you can actually go in, do your Soul Harvest, and back out to your position and maintain your execute that way. But that requires discipline, that requires situational awareness, that requires knowledge of the game mechanics. So it's not going to be good for everybody. So that's something you want to keep in mind. If you're not quite at that level yet, just don't bother using Soul Harvest and just maintain using your Destro ulti instead. So that's what I recommend doing for in terms of your execute phase. So with all that in mind, we're now going to go ahead into a 6 million dummy Parse. I will try to narrate during the Parse, try to point out the important bits, but because my Nightblade rotation is dynamic, I'm going to be focusing a lot more on my rotation. So I apologize in advance if I'm not talking very often, because I am focusing on my rotation, and there is a little bit of lag, so the Parse might not be as good depending on whether I get a lag spike during this Parse or not. So again, we're going to go ahead and get started with our Parse. So again, I'm prioritizing my bow procs above maintaining my dots. You also notice that I am preempting my bow proc, so whenever I see 4, I light attack and go immediately into my bow proc instead of using an ability instead. That's a common mistake done by beginner Nightblades, and it's totally understandable. So you kind of want to get yourself into the habit of preempting that bow proc. So that's what I'm talking about with the lag there. So if I have about 5 seconds left in my Merciless Resolve, and I know I'm not going to be able to get 5 weaves off, I'll just re-up it early. So you can see what I'm talking about, the Magicka Nightblade sustain. I really haven't dropped too badly, and I am sustaining perfectly fine right now. So we're near our execute, so now we're entering execute, so I'm basically going to maintain Blockade. I'm going to drop, and I'm going to start using Soul Harvest instead as my primary ultimate. I'm going to ignore bow procs from now on. Alright, so there we go. That is our Magicka Nightblade 6 million dummy Parse. So we can see our sustain was very good. Even throughout execute, we didn't really drop too badly in terms of Magicka. Take a look at our Parse. We can see our regen per second versus drain per second is very favorable. So that's kind of why Magicka Nightblades are so powerful, because their sustain is just so good. Now, taking a look at our Parse here, for Magicka Nightblades, light attacks should be your #1 source of DPS on your front bar. You can see here, with combined, my light attacks made up 20.5% of my DPS. So that's kind of what you're looking at, ideally with the Magicka Nightblade Parse. Your light weaving is very, very important for that Assassin's Will proc. You can see here, it made up an enormous amount of DPS here, and it hits quite hard, but not quite as hard as Impale, which is why we drop our bow proc during our execute phase. And now taking a look at our dots, we can see that obviously Impale is going to be top of the list. Then we have Blockade, our bow proc, Twisting Path, and then Crippling Grasp afterwards. So if you do need to end up dropping dots because you need to break your rotation due to rezzing somebody, or you have to play a mechanic, the two dots that you always want to maintain are going to be Blockade and Twisting Path. Crippling Grasp or Debilitate, that's kind of a secondary thought. If you look at the percentage difference, you're looking at 4% difference between Twisting Path and Grippling Grasp. So while Grippling Grasp is a fairly powerful dot, it's not nearly as powerful as Twisting Path or Blockade of Storms. So you want to maintain those dots over everything else. If you can get your bow proc off, get your bow proc off, and then depending on how much you have left on your Merciless Resolve, if you have like 5 seconds left, it's better off just to re-up it so you can get your next bow proc faster, rather than risk dropping that Merciless uptime and then losing out on that bow proc instead. So if, like I said, the general rule of thumb that I use is if I have 5 seconds left on Merciless when I use my bow proc, I'm just going to re-up it regardless of how much, whether I think I can get that third bow proc off or not. And then once you manage to get it off, you can just kind of reset yourself. I just go back to my back bar, just go Blockade, Crippling Grasp, and then go back to my front bar, and then go from there. Again, I do a dynamic rotation. You can go with a more static rotation and use Twisting Path every time you swap to your front bar, but that is a DPS loss, and you are going to end up using more Magicka in the end because you are going to end up overcasting your Twisting Path. So that's pretty much it for the Magicka Nightblade. A very powerful class to use with very good sustain and some pretty potent healing with if you decide to use funnel health. So it's a very powerful class, but again, like I said in the beginning of the video, there is a pretty steep learning curve when it comes to learning how to do this level of DPS on your Magicka Nightblade. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.